Some bonds are formed before we even understand what love means. They're woven into the fabric of who we are, in the way someone calls your name, in the way they hold your hand during a thunderstorm, in the way they make the world feel a little less terrifying just by being in it. And sometimes, those bonds become so deep, so all-consuming, that we lose the ability to see them for what they truly are. This is Emily's story, and it's not easy to tell, but it's one worth hearing. Emily Carter was 19 years old, and if you looked at her from the outside, standing in the doorway of her childhood home in Cedar Grove, Texas, arms wrapped around herself, like she was holding something in, you might think she was shy, quiet, maybe a little sad, and you'd be right on all three counts. She had dark brown hair that she kept pulled back in a loose braid, and gray-green eyes that always seemed to be watching something no one else could see. She wasn't the kind of girl who filled a room with noise. She was the kind of girl who noticed things. The way the light changed at 4 in the afternoon, the sound of the refrigerator humming in an empty house, the exact moment someone's smile didn't reach their eyes. She felt things deeply, almost too deeply, like her nerves were exposed to the open air, and every sound, every silence, every shift in someone's mood registered as a full-body experience. Therapists might have called it high sensitivity. Emily just called it being herself. She had grown up in a modest 2-story house on Clover Lane, the kind of street where the neighbors knew your name and the mailman stayed to chat. Her parents, Robert and Susan Carter, were decent people, busy people. Her father worked long hours at a civil engineering firm in Dallas, and her mother managed a dental office and volunteered at the church on weekends. They loved their children, but love, in the Carter household, was often expressed through provision rather than presence. Clean clothes, home-cooked dinners, a stable roof, not always a listening ear. And so, in that particular vacuum, in the space where attentiveness might have lived, Jason filled it. Jason Carter was 22 years old, 3 years older than Emily, and in many ways, 3 decades more settled. He was broad-shouldered, easy-smiling, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately made everyone in it feel like they'd known him their whole lives. He was a junior at Texas A&M, studying civil engineering like his father, and he had a laugh that bounced off walls and a handshake that made grown men feel respected. He loved his sister. That part was never complicated. It was the simplest, most uncomplicated love he had ever known, protective and steady, the way a tree grows around a wound in its bark. When they were little, he'd let her sleep in his room during thunderstorms. He'd helped her with her math homework at the kitchen table, teasing her every time she got a problem wrong, but never letting her give up. He taught her how to ride a bike when she was 7, running alongside her until his lungs burned, refusing to let go until she told him to. He never knew, not then, not for a long time, the gravity he held in her universe. To understand what happened between them, you have to understand what their childhood looked like, not the surface of it, not the family photos on the mantle or the Christmas mornings or the summer road trips to the Gulf Coast. You have to understand the texture of it, the quiet hours. Emily was 8 when she first understood what it felt like to be afraid of being left. It happened on a Tuesday. Their parents had gone to a dinner party, and Jason, 15 at the time, was babysitting. They'd watched a movie together, some animated adventure that Emily can't even remember the name of now, and at some point she'd fallen asleep on the couch with her head on his shoulder. When she woke up, he was gone. He'd moved to the kitchen to do his homework, just 20 feet away. But in those first disoriented seconds of waking up alone in the dark, the room strange, the house too quiet, she'd felt a terror so complete it stole the air from her lungs. She'd cried, ugly, gasping sobs that she'd been embarrassed about for years afterward. And Jason had come running, found her curled up on the couch with tears streaming down her face, and without a word, without a single question, he'd sat down beside her, put his arm around her, and said, "Hey, I'm right here. I didn't go anywhere." Those 4 words, "I'm right here," became, for Emily, the most comforting sentence in the English language. And Jason kept saying them, over the years, in different forms. When she got anxious before her 7th grade presentation, and he rehearsed it with her in the living room at midnight. When their grandmother died, and she couldn't stop shaking, and he sat on the bathroom floor with her while she cried. When she didn't make the high school volleyball team, and he drove her to Dairy Queen without being asked, and said they didn't deserve her anyway. He was always there, always catching her before she hit the ground, and slowly, so slowly that neither of them noticed it happening, Emily's world began to orbit around him, not because she'd chosen it, not because she was weak or broken or strange, but because Jason was the first person who had ever made her feel seen, truly, completely seen. And when you spend your whole childhood reaching for that feeling and finally finding it in someone, you don't let go easily. You don't let go at all. She was 16 when she first noticed that something had changed. It came on like a weather shift, the way the air pressure drops before a storm, the way the light goes strange and yellow, and you know something is coming before you can name it. Jason had come home for the summer after his freshman year of college. He was taller somehow, or maybe just more himself. He had a new energy about him, confident in a new way, more settled in his own skin. He'd started working out at the campus gym, and he'd cut his hair differently, and he laughed louder and easier than she remembered. Emily noticed all of it, and then one evening, they were sitting on the back porch watching the sun go down over the neighbor's roof, and he was telling her about his semester, a professor he respected, a class that had challenged him, a road trip he'd taken with his roommates to New Orleans, and she realized she was watching his face the way you watch a fire, unable to look away, not wanting to. She told herself it was just admiration, just pride, the way you look at someone you love and feel grateful they exist. But that night, alone in her room, the feeling didn't go away the way it should have. It sat in her chest, warm and complicated, and she turned it over in her hands like a stone she didn't know what to do with. She didn't name it. Not yet. She buried it in the back of a mental drawer and closed it and told herself it wasn't anything. But it was something. The confusion grew the way roots grow, invisibly, underground in the dark. By the time she was 17, it had wrapped itself around something structural inside her. She found herself calculating when he'd be home next. She felt a particular kind of loneliness that was specifically shaped like Jason's absence. When he called on Sunday evenings, she sat by the window and talked to him until her mother made her come to dinner. And then she'd count the days until the next call. She still didn't call it what it was. She called it missing her brother. She called it being close. She told herself that this was just what love felt like, the pure, overwhelming, specific love of one person for another. She didn't realize that the love she felt was being distorted by need, that attachment and affection had tangled so tightly inside her that she could no longer see where one ended and the other began. It happened on a Wednesday in October, the fall Emily was 18. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when Jason called, not on Sunday, which was unusual, and something in his voice was different, lighter, almost giddy. He was 21, 2 months into his senior year, and he said, very casually, "Hey, so, I've been seeing someone. I wanted to tell you before Mom and Dad." Her name was Rachel Nguyen, pre-med student, from Houston. She liked hiking and late-night diners and bad horror movies. She had a laugh, Jason said, That was completely ridiculous, loud and sudden and contagious. And he'd fallen for it on their first date. Emily said, "That's great, Jace. She sounds amazing." She said it perfectly. She used the right words in the right order. She even managed a small laugh. And then she hung up the phone and sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time. Something inside her had cracked open. Not loudly, not with the drama of breaking glass. More like the way ice cracks on a frozen lake. A sound you feel more than hear. A shift beneath the surface that tells you the ground is no longer solid. She tried to understand what she was feeling. She tried to name it fairly. And the name that kept coming back, the one that made her stomach drop, was jealousy. Not the ordinary kind. Not the sibling rivalry kind, where you feel left out or forgotten. This was something more specific, more intimate, and far more frightening. It was the jealousy of someone who felt replaced. She didn't want to feel it. God, she didn't want to feel it. She pushed it away with both hands. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She told herself she was just worried he'd have less time for her. She told herself 100 different reasonable things, and none of them made the feeling stop. She avoided his calls for 2 weeks. She said she was busy. She said she had midterms. She stared at her ceiling at night and felt something close to shame, a hot, crawling discomfort that made her want to disappear inside herself. What was wrong with her? She asked herself that question in the mirror. She asked it in the shower. She asked it lying in the dark with her headphones in, pretending the music could drown out her own thoughts. What was wrong with her? The guilt arrived like a second storm, right behind the first, because Emily was not a cruel person. She was not selfish in the ordinary sense. She was someone who thought carefully about right and wrong, who noticed when people were hurting, who cried at news stories about strangers. And now she was sitting with a feeling so confusing and wrong-shaped that she didn't know where to put it. She couldn't talk to her friends. How would she even begin? She couldn't talk to her mother. The thought alone made her face burn. She couldn't talk to Jason, obviously. She couldn't talk to anyone. So the feeling turned inward, the way feelings do when they have nowhere to go. It fed on itself. It became shame. It became the belief that she was fundamentally broken, somehow, that there was something malformed at the center of her that other people didn't have to deal with. She stopped eating as much. She slept more than she should. She withdrew from the small social life she'd managed in high school, stopped texting the 2 or 3 friends she had, stopped going to the community college events she'd sometimes attended. She spent a lot of time in her room with the curtains drawn, reading, or pretending to. Her mother noticed eventually. "Emily, are you okay? You seem tired." "I'm fine, Mom. Just stressed about school." And her mother, who loved her but was always moving, always busy, accepted that and moved on. Emily carried it alone. She carried the confusion, not understanding what she felt, unable to categorize it cleanly, unable to dismiss it. She carried the guilt, the certainty that even having these feelings was a moral failure, a betrayal of the brother who had never been anything but good to her. She carried the shame, the deep, private shame of believing herself to be someone whose feelings were wrong, broken, inappropriate. And underneath all of it, the loneliness, the particular kind of loneliness that comes from having something you can't share with the single person in the world. It's worth saying here, because this story deserves to be told with compassion, that Emily wasn't a bad person. She wasn't. She was a young woman who had spent her entire life funneling her need for emotional connection into one person. She had never been taught how to distribute that weight across multiple relationships. She had never been shown how to sit with her own feelings without needing someone else to regulate them. And so, when that need became enormous, when it outgrew the space labeled sibling love and started pressing against walls that weren't supposed to be there. She didn't understand what was happening. She only understood that she was suffering. There's a particular kind of desperation that comes at 3 in the morning. Emily had always believed in something, in God, or something like God, or at least in the idea that the universe wasn't entirely random and cold. She'd grown up going to church with her mother, and even though she didn't think of herself as deeply religious, there were moments of crisis, moments of confusion, when she found herself reaching upward in the old, instinctive way. This was one of those moments. She sat on the floor of her bedroom at 3 in the morning, back against the bed, knees pulled to her chest. The house was completely silent. Outside, a dog was barking somewhere far away, and the sprinklers in the yard next door kicked on and off. She was not crying, which felt strange. She thought she should be crying. Instead, she felt hollowed out, empty. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the ceiling, and she said, out loud, in a voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to stop feeling things I shouldn't feel. And I'm scared. She paused. The dog kept barking. The sprinklers turned off. I don't want to be this person. I don't want to feel this way. But I don't know how to make it stop. And I'm so tired of carrying it by myself. I'm so tired. She sat there for a long time after that, not really praying in any structured way, just existing in the quiet, in the dark, with a strange, tentative hope that somewhere, in the silence or beyond it, something had heard her, and something shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of movies, where light floods in and everything becomes clear, more like the way a fever breaks, slowly, quietly, with a sense of something having been endured and survived. She thought about who she was, not the feelings, not the confusing, shameful tangle of them, but who she was underneath. She thought about how she'd always been someone who felt too much, cared too much, needed too much. She thought about how Jason had become the container for all of it, the safe place she poured herself into. She thought about how utterly exhausting it must be to be her, and then immediately felt sorry for herself for thinking that. And then she thought something she hadn't thought before. What if this isn't about him? What if this was never really about him? She turned the thought over carefully, like something fragile. What if the feelings she'd been experiencing, confusing and painful and shape-shifting as they were never really about Jason at all? What if they were about the need itself, the enormous, bottomless need for someone to make her feel safe, to make her feel seen, to make her feel like she would not be left? What if Jason had simply been the only person who'd ever made her feel all those things, and the feelings had grown so large they'd started to wear the wrong name? She didn't fully understand it yet. It was just a question, but it was the right question, and sometimes that's enough. In January of that year, Jason graduated early with a semester of excess credits. He'd accepted a position with an engineering firm in San Francisco, an offer he'd worked toward for years, something he was deeply proud of. He told the family over Christmas dinner. Emily watched her parents congratulate him, watched her father stand up and shake his hand, watched her mother cry the good kind of tears. She watched all of it from across the table and felt something complicated move through her. Pride and grief, and something that might have been relief, though she wasn't ready to admit that yet. He left on a Sunday morning in January. The temperature was 38 degrees, which for Texas was practically Arctic. He packed 2 suitcases and a duffel bag into his truck, and the rest of his things would follow in a box shipment he'd arranged. He hugged their mother for a long time, then their father, and then he turned to Emily. She had rehearsed this moment. She'd told herself she would be calm. She would smile. She would say something like, "Go change the world," and mean it. She managed the smile, She didn't manage the calm. He hugged her, and she felt, for one awful, lurching second, the old familiar feeling, the one she'd been fighting for months, the one that said, "Don't go. Please don't go. I don't know who I am when you're not here." But underneath it, something else, something new, something that felt like the very beginning of courage. She stepped back first. She looked at him, really looked at him, her big brother, with his broad shoulders and his easy grin, and she said, "I'm proud of you, Jace. I really am." He ruffled her hair, the way he'd done since she was 6 years old. "Take care of yourself, fam. Call me, okay? Don't disappear." "I won't," she said. She stood in the driveway and watched his truck pull away. She stood there until the sound of the engine had faded completely, until the street was quiet again, until the cold had worked its way through her jacket. And then she went inside, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she was alone with herself, completely, unavoidably alone. And the world did not end. The year that followed was the hardest year of Emily's life. It was also, in hindsight, the most important. Without Jason's presence, without the gravity of him, the comfort of knowing he was just a phone call or a short drive away, Emily had no choice but to confront the things she'd been using him to avoid. The loneliness at the center of her, the fear of abandonment that had been living in her chest since she was 8 years old and woke up on a couch in the dark, the belief, buried deep and unexamined, that she was not capable of taking care of herself. She started seeing a therapist in February. Her mother helped her find someone, a woman named Dr. Anita Reyes, who worked out of a small office near campus and had kind eyes and a very direct way of asking questions that made you think she could see right through your forehead. The first 3 sessions, Emily talked around everything. She talked about her parents, her childhood, her fear of abandonment in the abstract. She talked about everything except the thing she'd actually come to talk about. Then, in the 4th session, Dr. Reyes asked, simply, "Who are you most afraid of losing?" And Emily, who had held it for so long, set it down. She talked for 45 minutes without stopping. She cried. She was humiliated. She expected judgment and received none. Dr. Reyes listened, asked clarifying questions, and when Emily had finally exhausted herself, said, "What you're describing is something we see more often than you might think. It's called enmeshment, and it can create emotional confusion that feels very real and very overwhelming, even when its source isn't what it appears to be." Emily stared at her. Enmeshment. Emotional boundaries that are too blurred. When we become so merged with someone, emotionally, psychologically, that we start to experience their existence as necessary for our own. The love is real, but it becomes tangled with fear, with dependency, and that tangle can sometimes present as feelings that don't fit the relationship. Emily sat very still. "So it wasn't really." "Your feelings were completely real," Dr. Reyes said carefully. "Pain is always real. Confusion is always real. But the story we tell ourselves to explain our feelings, that story can sometimes be wrong. And learning to tell a better story is part of how we heal." It was not a miracle moment. There was no sudden flash of clarity where everything resolved itself. But something settled in Emily's chest, something quiet and foundational, like a stone being placed in a wall that had long been missing it. She came back the following week, and the week after that. She started examining her attachment patterns with the methodical, slightly terrible honesty of someone who has decided to stop looking away. She traced the threads of her anxiety back to their earliest origins. She learned about the difference between connection and dependency. She started, slowly and imperfectly, to build relationships with other people, her college classmates, a girl from her literature seminar named Priya, who also liked to walk around the lake when she needed to think, a study group that met on Thursday evenings and gradually became something like friendship. She called Jason every few weeks instead of every few days. The calls were different now, lighter, more like two people with their own separate lives touching base. She asked about Rachel. She meant it. One evening, walking back from the lake with Priya, Emily realized that she hadn't thought about Jason in 4 days, that it hadn't been an absence she'd felt, that she'd been fully, contentedly here, in her own life, with her own thoughts, in her own skin. She stopped walking for a moment. "You okay?" Priya asked. Emily looked up at the sky, which was doing the thing Texas skies do in October, going deep purple at the edges, the clouds catching the last of the light in shades of gold and copper. It was beautiful in the uncomplicated way that beautiful things can be when you're finally paying attention. "Yeah," she said. "Actually, yeah. I really am." Part 9. 2 years later. Time has a way of doing what we cannot do ourselves. It moves slowly when you're in pain, and then all at once, you look up and realize that the distance between who you were and who you are has grown so large that the old version of yourself feels like someone you once knew, someone you understand and feel compassionate toward, but no longer are. 2 years after Jason left for California, Emily was 21. She had transferred to the University of Texas at Austin, where she was studying psychology, a choice that did not surprise Dr. Reyes in the slightest. She had a small apartment she shared with Priya, a part-time job at a bookstore, and a life that was genuinely, meaningfully her own. She had done the work, the unglamorous, difficult, incremental work of becoming a person who could sit with her own feelings without being overwhelmed by them, who could love people without needing them to be everything, who could recognize the difference between connection and survival. She understood now, with a clarity that had been built rather than bestowed, what had happened to her. She had been a child who needed more than she received, who learned early that one person could be a whole world, and who poured that need into Jason because he was safe and present, and had never once made her feel like she was too much. And those feelings, the confusing, shameful, terrifying feelings she'd carried for years, had not been love in the way she'd feared. They had been need, wearing love's clothing. They had been the sound of a frightened child, asking the only person who'd ever made her feel safe to please. Please never leave. She knew that now, and knowing it had not made the past years disappear, but it had made them navigable. It had made her something she hadn't expected, grateful. Grateful for the confusion, in a strange way, because it had forced her to find herself. Jason, for his part, was happy in San Francisco. Rachel had moved in with him 6 months after he arrived. They'd gotten a dog together, a ridiculous golden retriever named Cal, who appeared in roughly 40% of Jason's Instagram photos and had become something of a social media celebrity in their friend group. Emily had met Rachel over a video call the previous Christmas. She'd been nervous, unreasonably she knew, but Rachel had answered with that laugh Jason had described, loud and sudden and completely disarming. And Emily had laughed back, and it had been fine. It had been more than fine. Rachel was warm and genuine and clearly loved Jason in a way that made him better, easier, more patient, more at peace. Emily had watched them together on the screen and felt something she'd been afraid she would never feel. Relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief. Jason and Rachel got married on a Saturday in April when Emily was 22 years old. The venue was a vineyard in Sonoma County, California, in full spring. The hills green and rolling in gold, the air smelling of wildflowers and something Emily couldn't name but would remember for the rest of her life. There were about 80 guests. Rachel's family, large and warmly chaotic, filled one side of the ceremony seating. The Carters, smaller, quieter, filled the other. Emily was a bridesmaid. It had surprised her when Rachel asked, but it had been a genuine offer, given with the openness Rachel brought to everything. Emily had accepted with something that felt like grace. She wore a sage green dress that her mother had helped her find. She stood at the altar beside three of Rachel's oldest friends and watched her brother walk toward the woman he was going to spend his life with. His shoulders were back. His face was open. He looked like himself, like the most himself he'd ever been. And Emily watched him and felt, finally, cleanly, without the weight of confusion or shame, love. Just love. Simple, clear, brotherly love. The kind that had always been there, underneath everything. The kind that had been tangled up for years with all the things she'd never learned how to carry on her own, but that had always existed, pure and uncomplicated, at the center of it. She cried during the vows, but they were the right kind of tears. After the ceremony, during the reception, Jason found her standing alone at the edge of the vineyard, looking out at the hills. The evening was warm, and the light was the kind that makes everything look like it's been photographed through amber. He came and stood beside her. "You okay?" She smiled. "Yeah, I really am." He nudged her shoulder with his. "You've seemed good lately, Em. Like really good. I've noticed." She looked at him. Her brother. This person who had been her whole world for so long, and who was now just one part of it. A beloved part. An irreplaceable part. But one part. "I've been working on some things," she said. He nodded. He didn't ask more than that. He didn't need to. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, watching the hills go golden, listening to the reception noise drifting out from the tent behind them. Then Rachel appeared in the doorway, laughing at something one of her cousins had said, and Jason's whole face changed, lit up from the inside the way faces do when they see the people they love. "Go," Emily said, and she meant it with her whole heart. He went, and she stood there alone in the golden light, and felt completely, peacefully okay. Here is the truth that Emily took years to understand, and that maybe some of you listening to this story need to hear. Feelings are not facts. Feelings are information, urgent, overwhelming, real, but they are not always reliable narrators of what is actually happening inside us. Sometimes what we call love is loneliness wearing love's face. Sometimes what we call longing is grief. Sometimes the most powerful feelings of our lives are not about the person in front of us, but about the child we once were, still reaching for what they never had enough of. And that is not shameful. That is human.